Picture a freight truck sitting at the Ambassador Bridge between Detroit and Windsor. For decades, that crossing has operated almost invisibly.
Yeah, it's just a seamless route.
Right. As seamless as driving between two adjacent neighborhoods in the same city. But as of this week, that physical bridge is still there, but financially, that truck is driving into a brick wall.
Welcome to the Claire and Horatio Daily World Brief. You can find us at claireandhoratio.com. So, the economic integration between the United States and Canada is arguably one of the most stable relationships in modern history. But on Friday, trade talks between the two nations completely collapsed.
And collapse is almost an understatement here.
It really is. Late that evening, the U.S. enacted 50% tariffs on roughly $20 billion worth of Canadian goods. And we are not just talking about, niche industrial parts.
That was hitting everyday imports. Right. Everyday things. Wine, dairy, cement, clothing, even hockey equipment. And the Canadian reaction was immediate. Prime Minister Mark Carney announced dollar-for-dollar retaliatory tariffs taking effect on September 8th. And those are targeting American steel, dairy, and electronics.
The structural damage here, it extends far beyond a temporary diplomatic spat. I mean, these two economies are interwoven to a degree that dictates the daily cost of living for millions of people across North America.
Yeah.
Border states like Michigan and Ohio, they are now in a highly exposed position because they rely on fluid supply chains.
Especially manufacturing, right?
Exactly, manufacturing and agriculture. When a government drops a 50% tariff on cross-border commerce, the immediate public consequence is acute inflation on basic goods. So an Ohio construction firm buying Canadian cement, they suddenly see a massive chunk of their material budget just evaporate to a border tax.
Yeah.
And a Michigan auto plant sourcing Canadian aluminum faces the exact same math. Manufacturers cannot simply absorb a 50% cost increase.
Right. They either pass that cost directly down to the consumer, or they pause production and lay off workers.
Pretty much. Yeah.
The rhetoric surrounding this breakdown is particularly severe, too. President Trump claimed Canada wants the benefits of being a U.S. state without being one. But looking at the actual mechanics of the failed talks, Carney walked away because the U.S. demanded strict limitations on Canada's ability to strike trade deals with other nations.
Which is a huge shift.
It fundamentally changes the nature of the partnership. It is essentially like a roommate demanding veto power over your outside friendships. I mean, if we look past the political theater, the U.S. is essentially trying to mandate Ottawa's foreign policy.
Yeah, dictating external relations, it fundamentally rewrites the premise of national sovereignty within a regional trade bloc. Historically, agreements like the USMCA...
Which underpins what, like $1.6 trillion in annual commerce?
Yeah, $1.6 trillion in trilateral commerce between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Those agreements were designed to lower internal barriers and streamline regulations. They were never designed to restrict the external foreign policy of the member states.
Right.
So demanding that a sovereign nation limit its global economic partnerships in exchange for regional market access, it shifts the dynamic from a mutual economic partnership to a tributary system.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Canada currently sends about 70% of its exports to the U.S. When the terms of that severe economic dependency are suddenly weaponized, Ottawa is forced into a corner. They must urgently reevaluate their entire economic architecture and, seek new international alliances to offset American leverage.
And the willingness of the U.S. executive branch to unilaterally redefine boundaries, it's not limited to North American trade.
No, it's not.
Amid the stalled 6-month U.S.-Israeli war with Iran, Trump has declared the Strait of Hormuz a new U.S. territory.
Which is an incredibly bold claim.
Yeah, and in response, Iran's new hardline security chief, Mohsen Rezai, issued a severe warning. Rezai threatened that any neighboring countries joining what he terms the U.S. economic war or providing alternative oil routes will be considered enemies and targeted militarily by Iran.
Right, because the Strait of Hormuz is the central artery of the global hydrocarbon economy. Iran's threat is a direct countermeasure aimed at countries trying to bypass that choke point.
Like the French and the Saudis.
Exactly. French President Emmanuel Macron and the Saudi Crown Prince, they are actively holding discussions to develop those exact alternative routes outside the Gulf.
So what do those plans look like?
Their plans involve increasing trade through deepwater ports in Oman, expanding existing pipeline networks across Saudi Arabia, and developing new high-capacity rail links to move crude oil over land rather than through contested waters.
Okay, but we have to apply some basic logistical scrutiny to the Macron-Saudi discussions here. You cannot just build a pipeline overnight to replace a waterway that handles a fifth of the world's oil.
Oh, definitely not.
The volume of crude moving through the strait is just staggering. And laying thousands of miles of high-capacity rail or pipeline through desert terrain, that requires years of capital investment, engineering, and construction. So if Iran actually makes good on its threat to strike these developing alternative routes, the market shock seems completely unavoidable.
Yeah, the immediate consequence of Iran striking those nascent infrastructure projects, or even the neighboring countries hosting them, is a severe spike in household energy bills and global inflation.
Because it's not just about what gets destroyed.
Right. Oil prices do not only rise when a facility is physically destroyed, they rise based on the anticipation of risk. So if a shipping insurance firm in London categorizes a new Omani port or a Saudi pipeline route as an active war zone, the insurance premiums skyrocket.
Yeah, that gets passed on.
In many cases, the cost to insure a vessel actually exceeds the profit margin of the cargo itself.
Wow.
Supply chains constrict instantly. Governments worldwide are then forced into difficult choices regarding energy rationing, tapping strategic reserves, or heavily subsidizing fuel. And that directly impacts every citizen who needs to fuel a vehicle, heat a home, or, rely on goods delivered by diesel trucks.
And the threat of military strikes over economic disputes, it forces us to look at the actual human toll when that military force is deployed.
Yeah.
On Friday, in Myanmar's central Sagaing region, a military jet dropped 2 bombs, 15 minutes apart, on a Buddhist monastery. At least 14 civilians were killed. And they were just attending a week-long meditation retreat to mark Buddhist Lent.
Yeah, it's horrific. The United Nations Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, they have documented a sharp rise in these specific types of aerial attacks. A prominent conflict monitoring group recently accused the military junta of adopting a calculated terror strategy.
Meaning they aren't even aiming for military targets.
No, the goal is not to eliminate military targets. It is to deliberately target social gatherings, weddings, and religious festivals. Striking a meditation retreat maximizes the psychological impact on the civilian population. It sends a clear message that no communal space is safe from state violence.
And we are seeing a different conflict unfolding in Syria, where Israel recently struck a civilian vehicle in the village of Beit Jin. That strike followed an earlier Israeli attack on an airbase near the Turkish border, which was an action that actually drew a rare public rebuke from the U.S. for being an unnecessary escalation.
Right.
But both state actors in these distinct conflicts, the Myanmar junta in Israel and Syria, they utilize the exact same defense of preempting insurgents and terrorists to justify launching strikes in civilian areas.
And that defense is highly problematic from a legal standpoint. International humanitarian law relies entirely on the principle of distinction.
The distinction between military and civilian.
Exactly. This is the absolute legal requirement that armed forces must distinguish between combatants and civilians, and between military objectives and civilian objects. When state actors unilaterally define any gathering, whether it is a peaceful meditation retreat in Sagaing or a civilian vehicle traveling through Beit Jin as a preemptive terror threat, they effectively dismantle that legal guardrail.
So what are the civic stakes for global governance here?
They are profound. If the defense of preemption is accepted by the international community without any evidentiary burden, the protections outlined in the Geneva Conventions dissolve. Civilian casualties are no longer viewed as tragic collateral damage requiring independent investigation and accountability. Instead, they become normalized. They become calculated components of a broader military strategy.
For more daily briefings, brain candy explainers, and classic audiobooks, visit clarinhoracio.com.
And, the normalization of airstrikes in civilian areas, it ultimately leads us to what happens to the ground once the bombing stops.
The aftermath. Right, the aftermath. In Russian-occupied Mariupol, Ukraine, Russian contractors are rapidly building a high-rise residential complex called Leningradsky Kvartal. They are constructing these 12 to 15-story buildings directly over the physical ruins of apartment blocks that were destroyed during the 2022 siege.
Yeah, and the economic mechanics behind this construction project are highly calculated to cement demographic change. The Russian state is offering 2% mortgages exclusively to Russian citizens, with these new apartments selling for up to roughly $104,000.
And what about the original residents?
Well, the former Ukrainian residents who were violently forced out of those original buildings and lost everything in the rubble, they receive zero compensation, and they are actively barred from returning to their home city.
There is a detail from the neighborhood chat forums for these new complexes that is just incredibly difficult to process. The Russian newcomers are logging online to complain about construction noise, dusty roads, and renovation delays. They're having mundane disputes about homeowner inconveniences, completely ignoring the reality that they are living on sites where civilians were buried in rubble just a few years ago.
Weaponizing real estate in this manner is a foundational tactic of demographic engineering and settler colonialism. We saw similar strategies employed throughout the 20th century. Conquering powers would not only displace a targeted population, but actively pave over their cultural and architectural footprint.
To make it permanent.
Right. The goal is to create a new, sanitized reality for incoming settlers. By offering heavily subsidized 2% mortgages to its own citizens, the Russian state creates a vested, individual economic interest in the military occupation. Those new residents become civilian anchors for the conquest.
So the mundane complaints in the chat forums are almost a tool of that erasure.
They are. The mundane complaints illustrate the terrifying speed at which a manufactured reality can normalize an atrocity. The physical erasure of the Ukrainian city is complete when the new inhabitants view the blood-soaked ground purely as a real estate investment, actively denying the violence embedded in the foundation of their new homes.
While Ukraine faces this literal physical erasure by Russia, the country is also grappling with severe internal institutional strains. Mikhailo Fedorov, the recently sacked Ukrainian defense minister, issued a public statement asserting that President Zelensky has questions to answer regarding a $3 million money laundering probe.
Which is a massive accusation to make publicly.
It is. This criminal probe involves a senior official in the president's office who allegedly misappropriated funds to pay bail for a former energy minister.
And Fedorov is leveraging this specific corruption probe to openly call for national elections, which, are currently suspended in Ukraine under martial law. He is making the argument that a functioning democracy should not be held hostage to Putin's invasion.
But he's also making moves independently on the global stage.
Very much so. Fedorov is planning an independent trip to the U.S. to meet with Elon Musk. His stated goal is to convince Musk to extend Starlink satellite communications coverage deep into Russian airspace to assist with Ukrainian long-range drone warfare.
Okay, so we have to ask, is Fedorov genuinely putting his political career on the line to demand democratic integrity during a war? Or are we just watching a fired cabinet minister exact revenge and test the waters for his own presidential run while using Starlink access as leverage?
The reality of Ukrainian politics right now likely encompasses both elements. On one hand, Fedorov's demand touches on a genuine, critical civic concern. Suspending elections indefinitely during a prolonged, multi-year conflict risks eroding the exact democratic institutions the nation is fighting so hard to protect.
Because it centralizes power.
Exactly. Unchecked executive power, even when justified by wartime necessity, often breeds the exact type of corruption highlighted by that $3 million money laundering probe. But on the other hand, Fedorov is a highly popular figure. He is widely credited with modernizing Ukraine's armed forces through the rapid integration of drone warfare.
Right.
So by publicly positioning himself as the champion of transparency and maintaining independent diplomatic ties with powerful geopolitical figures like Elon Musk, he is undeniably cultivating a political profile entirely distinct from Zelensky.
Which creates a ton of friction.
The civic consequence for Ukraine is a dangerous, growing friction between the strict necessity of wartime unity and the democratic demand for governmental accountability.
Well, questions of governmental transparency, corruption, and military accountability are certainly not unique to Kyiv. They are actively straining U.S. institutions as well. Eric Slavin, the editor-in-chief of the U.S. military newspaper Stars and Stripes, was just fired for insubordination. His offense was stating during a media interview that editorial censorship is a red line.
And this dismissal did not happen in a vacuum. It is the culmination of a broader institutional conflict. The firing directly follows critical reporting by Stars and Stripes regarding severe mental health crises aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln.
Because that ship has been deployed for a very long time.
That particular warship has been deployed in the Gulf for over 240 days, and concurrently, the Pentagon has severely restricted press access across the board. They have refused to hold regular press conferences since May. and they are actively attempting to implement new rules that would bar journalists from reporting unauthorized information regarding troop deployments or conditions.
The structural setup of Stars and Stripes makes this a fascinating paradox. The publication is partially funded by the Pentagon, yet it is congressionally mandated to remain completely editorially independent so it can serve the troops objectively. If the editor-in-chief is fired for defending that independence, the implications for how we monitor deployed troops are massive.
Yeah, it severs the public's direct line of sight into the realities of military deployment. True civic oversight relies entirely on independent reporting to balance, verify, or challenge the official narratives provided by the state.
Especially when the state controls the deployment.
Exactly. When a publication like Stars and Stripes, which exists specifically to serve and inform the troops themselves, is penalized for reporting on deteriorating mental health conditions aboard a ship deployed for 240 days, it signals an institutional prioritization of public relations over personnel welfare.
It's a huge chilling effect.
Firing an editor for simply stating that censorship is unacceptable creates a profound chilling effect across all military journalism. The public consequence is a rapidly growing blind spot regarding how military operations are conducted, the actual human toll exacted on the service members, and the strategic rationale behind these prolonged deployments. Without a free press operating alongside the military, the armed forces operate largely shielded from democratic accountability.
And if the military establishment prefers to hide the human toll of warfare from the public, the logical conclusion of that desire is the rapid, unregulated development of technologies designed to bypass human infantry entirely. At the World Humanoid Robot Games in Beijing, a Chinese robot named Lightning ran the 100-meter sprint in 9.32 seconds. That time shatters Usain Bolt's human world record.
The organizers in Beijing, they framed this event as a harmless sporting spectacle, utilizing massive choreographed displays of synchronized coordination among hundreds of robots. However, the geopolitical context surrounding these machines tells a much darker story.
Yeah, the U.S. response tells you what you need to know.
Right. The U.S. Federal Communications Commission recently instituted a ban on the import of new foreign-made humanoids, explicitly citing national security concerns. Additionally, the Pentagon has officially flagged several Chinese robot makers, including leading firms like Unitree, for having direct, explicit ties to the Chinese military apparatus.
We absolutely cannot look at this as a mechanical track star or a quirky tech demonstration. We're looking at the chassis for autonomous infantry. If a machine can navigate uneven terrain and sprint faster than the fastest human in history, the primary mechanical hurdles of ground combat are essentially solved. I need to understand what this does to the threshold for starting a war.
It fundamentally alters the threshold by decoupling physical risk from the decision to wage war. Traditional warfare, for all of its inherent horror, contains a built-in friction. Human soldiers require rest, they possess moral hesitations, they suffer trauma, and their casualties incur a severe, often career-ending political cost for the leaders back home.
Body bags have a political cost.
Precisely. Autonomous humanoid infantry removes every single element of that friction. A state possessing this technology can deploy lethal force without risking the lives of its own citizens. This drastically lowers the political barrier to initiating a conflict.
Because you aren't sending your own people.
Furthermore, when you combine these advanced mechanics with artificial intelligence, the actual decision of target selection and engagement is handed over to an algorithm. This challenges the foundational ethics of conflict. It erases the human capacity for situational mercy, judgment, or hesitation on the battlefield. It replaces the complex morality of a human soldier with a binary execution code.
The pace of these developments is staggering. When we look across the expanse of the events unfolding as of the episode date, the volume of systemic friction is immense, and the direction we are heading feels dangerously unpredictable.
There is a distinct pattern emerging across today's briefing. The established guardrails of the post-war consensus are facing immense strain. We are seeing the deliberate dismantling of foundational trade treaties between deeply integrated allies, the aggressive erosion of press freedoms within democratic military institutions, and the suspension of democratic elections in active conflict zones.
While unilateral power just accelerates.
Exactly. This raw, unilateral power is rapidly accelerating. It manifests in the punitive application of 50% tariffs, state actors utilizing airstrikes in civilian areas under the guise of preemption, and the unchecked global pursuit of autonomous military technology. The long-standing reliance on mutual agreements, transparency, and international law is being aggressively replaced by the unilateral assertion of brute force and economic leverage.
It reinforces the vital importance of maintaining civic vigilance in an era where facts, historical realities, and democratic norms are so easily obscured by state narratives and chat forum complaints. We return to that image of the freight truck stopped at the border crossing. It is a physical manifestation of how quickly binding treaties can turn into concrete barriers and how rapidly the rules we rely on to govern our lives can be rewritten without our consent. If the architecture of global trade, warfare, and human rights can shift this dramatically in a single week, understanding the mechanics behind these changes is the only way to anchor ourselves in what is real. Thank you for joining us. Check out claireandhoratio.com for debate candy and classic audiobooks.